The Cyber Effect, Chapter 5, Teenagers, Monkeys, and Mirrors. With the ever-expanding use of social media, selfies and other forms of expression have proliferated online. The incident involving Malik Whiter's photobomb selfie showing his teacher going into labor in the classroom is just one of countless examples of how social media can be used to break the boundaries of interpersonal conduct. Others post selfies like the girl who snapped a picture of herself in front of someone trying to jump from a bridge to commit suicide. And these are the actual photos Dr. Aiken describes in her book. Now, selfies aren't brand new, but they are new or recent in digital form. But we've been creating selfies forever, for as long as people have been painting, like Rembrandt. Self-portraits are a form of selfie. And this modification of Johannes Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring is another example. But of course we have much more common examples of selfies. We love to take selfies with famous people. Famous people love to take selfies of themselves. And of course this took no higher form than Kim Kardashian's book, Selfish. So there are countless reasons social media users post selfies, including just for fun, to enhance your social status, to test the boundaries of adult behavior, to take pleasure in other people's misfortune, also known as Schadenfreude in using the German word, learning to deal with a range of emotional experiences, testing and forming one's own identity, and to mimic and try to surpass what other people have done, what they've done in real life and what they've done on social media. But teens and young adults, which is the focus of this chapter, are using social media as part of their identity formation process. They're discovering who they are online, constantly updating their self-concept. They crave belonging to the peer group, which requires constant feedback from others that I fit in. How has social media altered the judgment or decision-making processes of children, teenagers, and young adults? A personality trait called narcissism, which, like all traits, exists on a spectrum from very low to very high, is characterized by attention-seeking, fantasizing about success and power, having a grandiose or elevated sense of importance and entitlement, as well as a lack of empathy toward the distress of others. We all have a certain level of narcissism. That means that a certain level must be healthy if it is a common personality trait. A healthy level of narcissism helps us to believe in ourselves so that we can keep progressing, developing necessary traits that help us tackle life's ever-changing challenges. But teenagers may be especially vulnerable to overreaching or overinflating their sense of importance. Humans are the only species that seems to naturally develop the ability to recognize themselves in mirrors. This tends to happen between 1.5 and 2 years of age. Adult chimpanzees can learn to recognize themselves in mirrors after a few days of exploration in front of a mirror. Self-recognition is a manifestation of self-awareness and the development of the self-concept. While monkeys raised in the wild show little interest in mirrors, those raised in isolation become fascinated with their own reflection and disinterested in other monkeys. Could human children raised on a diet of social media and other eye technology and not enough face-to-face interaction with live humans remain more interested in isolation, being apart from others, retreating to the comfort of their own digital self, rather than relying on the reward of care from family and friends? Humanistic psychologist Carl Rogers explained that there are three components of the self-concept: our views of ourselves, the value we place on ourselves, and the self we wish we were. These are labeled the self-image, self-esteem, and the ideal self. Dr. Akin proposes that for the digital or social media generation, we may need to include the cyber self as a fourth component. Today's teen and young adult is constantly creating and reinventing this cyber self. Selfies are created as a question asked of the viewer. Do you like me like this? In 1900, Charles Cooley described looking glass theory, which described how people use their perception of how others view us, the feedback we get from others, to describe how people come to understand themselves. We view ourselves through others' eyes. The human self-concept is dependent upon social feedback. William James, a founder of American psychology, argued that we have many selves, depending upon the contexts in which we exist, with different people. In other words, we adapt. Our self is constantly adapting to different contexts and relationships. Given the dramatically expanded number of online social contexts and friends we have now on social media, do we have a different self with each person, each group, or each app? Does this explosion of selves cause a splintering of identity? Could this pressure to continuously be a different self be harmful to the development of young people, preventing them from developing a core or a true self? The amount of feedback we get on social media is far greater than real-life feedback. Prior to the internet, we had a much smaller, more stable set of others on whom we relied on feedback to develop our sense of self. Now, of course related to FOMO, or fear of missing out, we are constantly joining new groups and activities, from which we are receiving an ever-changing set of feedback about ourselves. How could someone possibly interpret, filter, process, and use that much information? The online cyber self is always on, always triggering feedback. It is a constant feedback loop. Narcissism is a natural characteristic during adolescence, as young people struggle to create a sense of self and identity. But recent studies show it is something that emerging adults aren't growing out of as they normally did. This trend coincides with the rise of social media, but it also coincides with the rise of overprotection and overpraising by parents. Helicopter parents and lawnmower parents included. Jean Twenge's 2010 book, The Narcissistic Epidemic, shown here, made the empirical case that recent generations have become more narcissistic than their adult cohorts. But even more recent than Jean Twenge's research, shown here in the bottom right, a group of researchers demonstrated that there is no evidence that the present generation of college students is any more narcissistic than college students were 10 and 20 and 30 years ago. So we have conflicting evidence about whether or not young people are more narcissistic. Further, our cyber self can get better with age, compounding this issue or question of narcissism. Getting better with age online is the reverse of what normally happens. People can Photoshop their images with the ever-improving apps like Facetune, BodyTune, and my favorite, Slim and Skinny. Using these apps can strengthen our self-image, and that can be wildly different than our real selves. Apps like Tinder, on which people tend to exaggerate or accentuate their physical appearance, have arguably skewed the way we think of ourselves and our identities. This may be more troubling when teens portray themselves in provocative ways on social media compared to more mature young adults, ages 18 to 30, doing the same thing. Social media tends to normalize extremes of behavior, another example of the cyber effect. So, photos showing a person wearing revealing clothing has become normalized. The popularity of selfies and cyberbullying may be related to the recent rise in plastic surgery and teeth whitening products and other body-enhancing or image-enhancing products. Dr. Akin argues that the following are all related. Number one, the rise of apps to improve appearance. Number two, the increase in popularity of plastic surgery. Number three, the increase in popularity of people posting provocative or sexually revealing selfies. And number four, the quest for the perfect body. We all seem to want to be more attractive, to have a more exciting self. Our online self also matters for our future, however. For our jobs, for getting into college or graduate school. And this is what Dr. Akin calls our social capital, the economic value of our social network identities. Now, as an aside, of course, this was not an issue when Dr. Akin published her book, but of course this is why younger generations are no longer posting their private information on Facebook. As you guys always say, Facebook is for family. Prior to the last 15 years, self-image problems were much more common among girls. But today, boys present with eating disorders, and more teens, including boys, are presenting with body dysmorphic disorder, which is characterized by having an intense anxiety about how someone looks. Now, this issue, of course, impairs all aspects of life and social interactions. The cyber self is like a detached self, like a puppet. This self-objectification, this sense of detachment from one's true self, may contribute to many of the negative online behaviors discussed in Dr. Akin's book. People can feel less accountable for their behavior. Carl Rogers, one of the early leaders of the humanistic theory and humanistic therapy movement, explained that psychological health exists in people whose actual self and ideal self are congruent. In other words, who you really are and who you want to be, the actual self and the ideal self. When they match, when those two are the same person, then a person is more psychologically healthy. This is what Carl Rogers called a self-actualized individual. Yet that doesn't typically happen among teenagers or most very young adults. In fact, as Dr. Akin reports, one study showed that 50% of teenagers agreed that they find it easier to be themselves online than in real life. Erik Erikson, who created the psychosocial theory of personality development, argued that identity formation occurs in the context of a full and complete exploration of one's abilities and one's true nature, where one truly fits in. Erickson, of course, worked well before the invention of the internet, so his view was that finding one's true identity happened through real-life interactions. The failure to fully explore and discover one's true identity, according to Erickson, will impede or interfere with one's ability to tackle the next task of life in young adulthood, the challenge Erickson called intimacy versus isolation. The ability to develop deep, meaningful, lasting relationships with adult, same-age peers, both friendships and romantic relationship or relationships, and a true partnership. This failure to develop a true identity is also what concerns Philip Zimbardo regarding adolescent boys who spend so much time playing video games and accessing online pornography. Cyber self is a masterful creation. It's funnier, better looking, and smarter than the real self. The problem lies in the vulnerability of this split self existence. Taking a sext as a teenager and sending it to others as a minor is against the law. This is dissemination of child pornography. Yet about half of teenagers still do it. Sexual curiosity is a natural part of being a teenager, as is breaking the rules of society and seeing what one can get away with. Sexting is the new cyber norm. Adults and legislators, our senators and congressmen and women, are constantly trying to keep up with changes in the way social media and the internet are changing the lives of children, teens, and young adults. David Finkelhor and Janis Wallach argue we can't scare children and teens into avoiding all the ways they communicate and share images about sex on the internet and social media. Teenagers in America often, or usually, don't respond well to being warned or told what not to do by adults. And there could be a boomerang effect, causing teenagers to hide their behavior even more in order to not get into trouble. We shouldn't criminalize most of these, they say, but we should expand the discussion of these issues and these behaviors in sex ed classes, along with expanding the discussion of problems like bullying, normal issues of dating and relationships. But of course, the problem is that lots of teenagers don't want to talk about those things with adults. So it takes a special kind of teacher to be able to run those kinds of classes. Teens have more trouble resisting an impulse to sext or to get revenge on a past partner by posting sexually revealing photos or videos of them online, called revenge porn. Posting sexually provocative images online can sometimes lead to what's called sextortion, when someone captures those images and blackmails the subject of the images by asking for money or more images, or else the photos and videos will be shared with others online. Teenagers and young adults are more impulsive than older adults, simply because they're less mature, and they're more vulnerable to the anonymity and lack of accountability issues we've covered. Teenagers, in many ways, exhibit a lack of concern about their privacy online. They care less, and they care differently than previous generations do or did about personal information. The paradox is that in real life, they tend to be very self-conscious and guard their privacy. I, your professor, think this paradox is in part accounted for by the fact that they feel anonymous and less accountable online. Almost everything you're learning about in this class relates to the 4 A's presented on day 1. According to Dana Boyd, teens adjust what they present online depending on the audience they want to impress. They engage in what is called situational privacy. We often take more risks when we're part of a group compared to when we're alone. Teenagers fall prey to what's called the risky shift phenomenon. They're more judgment impaired when other teens are there, or when they think others are watching, or when they think other people are going to find out about their behavior. More likely to take risks. They want to impress others. This is similar to the phenomenon we call group think. The larger the group, the more people tend to conform in order to fit in. Large groups of teens online, connected by social networks, are likely to behave in riskier ways. And the larger the group, the more pressure there is to conform. Using a ghost app to hide images on their mobile phone from, of course, parents is a common behavior these days. And the ghost app, which looks like a calculator or something else, parents wouldn't suspect. Dr. Akin labels this tendency to engage in risky behaviors online in the context of large group peer pressure, the cyber risky shift phenomenon. The last part of this chapter includes a number of topics that are only covered briefly, and you could certainly expand upon these topics if you haven't chosen your own paper topic. I would suggest considering some of the topics that she doesn't cover as extensively. So this is one of them. There are plenty of nefarious males out there who surf social media sites looking for vulnerable girls that they can talk into gradually engaging in sex for profit. And at the time of the publication of her book, Dr. Akin reports that there were 20 million victims of human trafficking around the world. And she talks about an organization in Washington, D.C. called Fair Girls. And I looked this up online, and here it is. And you can find this website really easily. Fair Girls was co-founded in 2003 by Andrea Powell and Caroline Tower Morris to help provide long-term therapeutic interventions, including safe housing, for exploited and trafficked young girls and young women. Craigslist was well known for years for fostering sexual abuse and human trafficking, the human sex trade, and was finally forced to shut down its adult services section in 2010. Dr. Akin talks about the cognitive differences in the way we think about ourselves. And this has to do with the way we use the words I versus me. So when I say things using the word I'm referring to myself in the subjective sense. That is, when I say I posted a photo or I posted a selfie. It is the expression is as a subject. That is, I'm doing the action. When we use the word me, we're placing ourselves as the object in the communication in the sentence. So when someone says she cyberbullied me, that is, you're the target of the action, right? You're not the subject, you're the target of the action, the object. So Dr. Akin explains that when we use the word I, we are referring to our authentic self, the real self. And she argues that when we post selfies, that's a reflection of the me self. because what we're trying to do is get people to look at us. So if you take a picture of yourself and you don't post that, you just like that picture of yourself, that may be normal, it may be narcissistic, but if you don't post it online, then you're not directing it to get feedback from other people. You're not trying to get feedback or a reflection of others. So a photo you take of yourself for yourself would be a reflection of your I, whereas posting a selfie is a reflection of your social image or your me self. Dr. Akin argues that with every selfie taken and posted, the true self is diminished. The I self, your core self, is diminished. And in fact, in Aboriginal cultures, native peoples, they believe that every photograph robs a part of your soul. So every photograph taken of yourself robs a part of your soul when other people are taking it, or when you take a photo and post it. Next, she argues that it is time for these tech companies, for there to be technological developments for the greater good. So tech companies like Facebook need to step up and address problems that are caused by their products. And parents need to have conversations with their kids about everything their kids are doing online.